Hi, good afternoon. My name is Brian Niiya. I'm the content director at Densho, and I'd like to welcome you to our panel titled From Hawaii to Jerome, Arkansas. And we're going to learn about the story of the Japanese Americans from Hawaii who were sent to Jerome, kind of an unusual story in the annals of the War Relocation Authority concentration camps. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of the story of removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans from Hawaii, and then a little about the Jerome group. And we're going to turn it over to a panel of 4 people who actually were at Jerome with their families. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers and further discussion. So yeah, thank you for joining us for this program. So as I said, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the overview of the Hawaii incarceration story. I think most of you watching this will know that unlike what happened on the West Coast, Japanese Americans in Hawaii were not interned en masse. Instead, it was a selective internment. But at the very beginning, right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, what happened in the 2 places is actually fairly similar, which is to say that right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the FBI and local law enforcement began to arrest Japanese American community leaders, mainly Issei, in both places, from lists that they had compiled over the prior decade based on surveillance by various intelligence agencies, and basically arrested Issei community leaders. My grandfather, who was a newspaper editor in Honolulu, was one of those arrested on the night of December 7. These men, and they were almost entirely men, were first held in local facilities on the various islands, and the group was eventually consolidated at Sand Island, which was an internment camp built on in Honolulu Harbor on an island, and all the Issei internees were eventually gathered there. Martial law, of course, was declared the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then from February of 1942, these Issei internees were sent in groups to the continent, to various internment camps whose names that are probably familiar to you if you know the story: Lordsburg and Santa Fe, New Mexico, Missoula, Montana, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and many others. They were given hearings, although they were kind of the kangaroo court variety. And ironically, some were paroled, but they were paroled to go to War Relocation Authority concentration camps, where at least they were able to, in some cases, reunite with their families. There's about 700 in this group. As I said, almost entirely Issei, although there were a handful of Nisei, and there were a very small number, less than 10 women also in this group. And in addition to this 700, there were about 100 internees who were of German or Italian descent also, who were resident in Hawaii, or actually, as it turns out, who were thought to be of German or Italian descent. Of course, after this initial roundup, there was a great diversion between what happened on Hawaii and on the West Coast. Executive Order 9066 is issued by President Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, and that authorizes the mass removal and incarceration of 110,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast. So the West Coast is basically purged of all Japanese Americans. There was some sentiment to do the same in Hawaii, but the martial law government and other community leaders in Hawaii opposed that. And it's a complicated story, but for a lot of reasons that did not occur in Hawaii. And instead in Hawaii, there was just a selective internment that followed. For the purpose of this presentation, there are essentially 3 other groups from Hawaii that were interned, in addition to that initial Issei leader group. The first were a group of mostly Nisei internees who remained imprisoned in Hawaii for the duration, first at Sand Island, and then after 1943 at the Honouliuli camp located in central Oahu. It was a fairly small group, about 250 or so. And as I said, they were mostly Nisei, and of those, most were Kibe. The second group were family members of Issei internees who had expressed the desire to go to Japan. and they were sent to the what was called the family camp, the Justice Department family camp in Crystal City, Texas. And my mom's family were among this group, and they were reunited at Crystal City. Again, fairly small group, a couple hundred people, 250 people in that group. And the largest group is the group that we're going to be talking about today, about 1,000 from Hawaii who were sent directly to War Relocation Authority camps at the end of 1942 and into early 1943, of which about 80%, about 800 were sent to Jerome, the rest, 200 and change, sent to Topaz. Most of this group were also family members of Issei internees. And I think all of the people you'll be hearing from on this panel fall into that category. They're all children of men who had been interned previously and sent to mainland camps where they would be reunited at Jerome. But there were also others in that group that I think we know a little less about. Others from Hawaii who were sent to Jerome included those who the military government viewed as being a drain on the economy, quote unquote, or because they were viewed as dangerous for various reasons. So in the end, about 2,000 from Hawaii were interned or incarcerated, which was barely 1% of the total Japanese American population in Hawaii. I would argue, though, that the impact of this internment or incarceration of folks in Hawaii was much greater than that, given that these were community leaders, you know, they're your Buddhist priests, newspaper editors, Japanese language school principals. It really tears apart the fabric of the community and really affects many more people. And also, you had continual sorts of trickles of arrests that continued through the duration of the war that I think served to keep people on watch or on their best behavior, knowing that they were being watched. My dad, you know, on the Big Island, always tells stories about how the FBI would come and make it known that they were kind of keeping an eye on his father and the family. And so I think there was that chilling impact of this trickle of internment that kept going through the war. So anyway, I'm going to turn now to the Jerome group. As I mentioned, about 800 from Hawaii came directly to Jerome in late 42 and 43. They came in three groups. There was a first group of 107 that came mostly from Honolulu, and they arrived at Jerome in November of 42. The largest group, a group of 443, arrived at Jerome in January of 43. And I think all of the people on our panel would be in that group from January. They came from all of the different islands, and it was a mixture of some single men, mostly Kibe, who had already been interned from Sand Island, as well as the internee family members that you'll be hearing from. And then there was a final group of 260 who arrived a month later in February of 43. Many of this group were fishermen and families from the Kaka'ako area on Oahu who had lost their livelihoods. The Hawaii group was mostly assigned to blocks 38, 39, and 40 in Jerome, which was located in the lower portion, southern portion of the camp. And by the accounts that I've looked at contemporaneously, as well as oral histories, they remained a fairly distinct group. According to a community analysis report, they were frequently seen to wear geta and aloha shirts and to remove their shoes before going into barracks. Many coming from the tropics now to Jerome in the middle of winter where it was very cold. They were not properly dressed, and other Jerome inmates actually helped raise money so that they could get proper clothing. They had to be shown how to use stoves, because that's not something you do in Hawaii, is have stoves that you use for heating. And some of the young men from Hawaii soon gained a reputation for being troublemakers from both the WRA and other inmates. Interestingly, a very high percentage of the Hawaii group who went to Jerome in the wake of the loyalty questionnaire, well over half of them ended up going to Tule Lake, which ended up contributing to the overall high number of Jerome people who were sent to Tule Lake. I think, as you probably know if you're watching this, Jerome closed early in June of 1944. And the Jerome inmates were then sent to one of 4 other camps, generally Rower, Gila River, Amachi, or Heart Mountain. And for reasons I'm not quite sure of, the majority of the Hawaii people left in Gila left in Jerome, transferred to Gila River, about 60% of them. And I think that's true for the people in our panel, which is far more than the general population. About 35% of the Jerome folks transferred to Gila when Jerome closed. And then after that, after the war ends, I think the majority of the Hawaii folks eventually returned to Hawaii, but there were a group who stayed in the continental US as well. Among some of the prominent Hawaii Nikkei at Jerome in these groups were Harry Shiramizu, who was a journalist who became the last editor of the Denson Tribune, which was a Jerome camp newspaper. Kazuo Miyamoto, a physician and writer that's probably best known for his 1964 autobiographical novel, Hawaii, End of the Rainbow, which has some really interesting passages about his memories of Jerome. He actually started writing that while he was interned. Bert and Lillian Nakano, old friends who are among the founders of NCRR and key figures of the redress movement. They were both at Jerome with their families as teenagers, although they didn't actually meet and marry until later, after the war, back in Hawaii. And the artist George Hoshida, whose daughters will be part of the panel that you'll be hearing from shortly. Before I turn it over to the panel in a moment, I just also want to acknowledge Sheila Chun and the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii's Resource Center. Sheila's a longtime volunteer there. Sheila and I have been corresponding on this group of the group from Hawaii who ended up at Jerome and Topaz, and her doing research on the Hawaii end and me on the WRA materials and so a lot of the research here is as much due to Sheila as to myself, and I'm hoping Sheila will one day write something up on this. So, but anyway, with that quick overview and introduction to the Hawaii and to the Jerome Hawaii people and Jerome story, let's go to the panel, which we pre-recorded a couple days ago, and after that, everyone will come on live and will be around to answer questions and have further discussion. So. Let's go to the panel.
My name is Patricia Kirita-Nomura, and I was originally from Kohala, Hawaii.
Oh.
Yeah, and the night of December 7th, my father, the sheriff came and got my father, and we didn't know what was happening, and they took him. And I remember I was in the bedroom, and my mother was crying, and I guess she didn't know what was happening. And so he went to jail, and then we had to bring some clothes for 3 days, and then they moved him to Hilo, to that camp, and from there on, a year later, I was taken out of my class, and my sister, younger sister too, and we had to go. They said we had to go home. When we went home, we saw an army truck, and my older siblings were packing all our things in duffel bags, and we got on the truck. And when we passed Kohala and Kohala High School, we didn't even get to say goodbye to our friends. We got to Hilo, and we stayed in a hotel, and there were other internees there. They were picked up, from the different towns and on the Big Island. And we got on this little boat, shipping boat, and went to pick up the other families. And then we landed in Honolulu, and we were at the administration station. And then I believe we spent Christmas on the Lurleen, but the children were all had to sleep in the bottom of the boat, and it was crowded, and there were bunks, and my mother and my baby brother, they were all up in cabins. We spent Christmas, I believe, on the boat. I'm not sure whether it was administration building or the boat. And then we went to San Francisco on January 7th. It was so cold, but the Red Cross, I believe, gave us sweaters and gloves. Of course, for me, it was an adventure coming from a small town in Kohala and going to San Francisco. Then they hauled us into, I believe, on the train. Yeah. And then, of course, we had to always put the shades down and at night, so we couldn't see much. But after 5 days, I believe, we landed in Jerome. And the people, the mainland people who were there, they thought we are from Hawaii, so had grass skirts, and they talked. They asked us if we lived in grass huts, but it was very, very cold. And then we were distributed blankets and things, and then we were in barrack 39, I believe, and that, and I believe the Hoshidas were right across us.
Mhm.
Then during, of course, when Mississippi River flooded, we were flooded too. And my mother used to uh, bring our food, especially during when there was a blizzard. But I know that it was difficult to even walk to school. And but we all went to school. And during blizzard days, my mother would bring our food from the mess hall. She worked in the mess hall for $16 a month, and she had to scrub pots and feed us, all of us in the mess hall, except during blizzard days, she would bring it to us. Um, did go to the Jerome reunion and saw that there was nothing there except a smokestack. And I remember my sisters, the older sisters, were able to go to Camp Shelby. And they were called the Denson USO. And they entertained and danced with the 442 boys. And the boys came over, and that's how we were able to get some pictures that I had uh, gotten, and also had the Jerome annual. Yeah. Um, but in Christmas time, I remember Mr. Finch used to come and give us candies. And yeah, but it was very, I hated to take the chimbas, you know, uh, because we had to do our thing in the barracks, and we had to take it to the bathroom, the big bathroom. And uh, even during cold weather, because I was younger, and it's not too embarrassing for me, a young person to take the chimba to the bathroom. Oh, and but the food wasn't bad. Um, uh, yeah, and then in our school, yeah, we were able to go to school, but then my father was still in camp, and in I believe at that time he was in Louisiana, and then they shipped him to New Mexico. But we didn't. We expected to see him earlier, but we didn't see him until about a year and a half, and that's when he had to decide whether to go to Tule Lake and go back to Japan or to go back to Hawaii. Um, and right now, when we went to Jerome, I felt like the second time when we went on a visit, um, there was a monument, and I remember it saying that this prejudice, we hope that they will learn from it, from what happened to us, that it will never happen again. But it's still happening.
Yeah, so I'm Gerald Satoru Takesono, and emphasize the Satoru part because Gerald is not a legal name, and that's because of the internment. But not to get to that story, my father was a Buddhist minister. At that time, he was in Hilo, and just after or around the time of Pearl Harbor, my mother and my father and my sister, who was born in September 41, were transferred to Maui, Wailuku. So he was now at Wailuku Honganji. So they didn't find him. The FBI didn't find him till May. And so he was not arrested until much later than everybody else. So in May of 42, he was arrested and then eventually taken to Sand Island and eventually to Lordsburg. My mother, and I have to find out when exactly, but my mother and my sister were sent to Jerome. And so they were with that Hawaii contingent and went to Jerome. And a good family friend of ours for that whole period, Jerome and Tule Lake, were the Ozakis, Otokichi Ozaki and his wife and the children. And we remained family friends till today. They've all passed away now. But anyway, my connection in Jerome was I wasn't born there, but I was conceived there. And that's another story. And then, yeah, so I was born in Tule Lake. Oh, presently I'm a retired dentist. Went to Northwestern in Chicago where I met a lot of, um, if we can pardon the expression, kotonks, who I don't use that pejoratively, but it's an easy word to use. Much easier than Japanese Americans from the mainland. But I met a lot of them there at the Midwest Buddhist Church, and we shared stories. And many of them were from Jerome or from Roar.
I am a Kotonk, so
I am too, technically.
yeah, kind of. That's right. You were born in California.
One of my nicknames was Barbed Wire Baby. Guess what?
My name is June Mitsuko Hoshida-Honma. I was born in Hilo, Hawaii in June of 1936. The war began for me on the first weekend in February of 1942. My father was fixing the screen of our new home when my uncle, who was a detective in the Hilo Police Department, came up the porch crying. And I was standing there and I was wondering why. And he said, they never called him George or Yoshio. They called him Hosang because of our last name. So he said, Hosang, that he had to take him away from us. And so my mother helped my father pack a little bag, and we didn't know exactly where he had gone. Later, my uncle came again and took us up to the Kilauea military camp where my father was staying until he was shipped up to the mainland. I know my son told me that my father went through 8 different camps. I know he was in Fort Sam Houston, he was in Lordsburg, and then he went to Santa Fe, and then we were shipped out in December of 42. My mother at the time had just gotten our youngest sister, Carol, who was about 2 months old when we were taken. She had 3 days, and I remember she made these huge canvas bags and packed our things in there, then sold the house because my father had not replied in time what to do with the house. So here we are in this brand new house, and we're being shipped out. I know we went on a ship from Hilo Bay, and as I was looking at the island, Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa had clouds around it, and you could see shafts of sunlight coming through the clouds. That kept me going for 3 years because I was so homesick. I remember we went on the ship, and then we went to Oahu, and we were in Sand Island in this INS building. I remember that I was 6 years old at the time. My mother had the baby, and I stood in line with all these mothers, warming up, trying to warm my sister Carol's milk up. Then the women, the one room was for women and children. Another room was for the boys, bachelors. Another room was for the single women. And we had to climb upstairs to get to where we were. The building is no longer there. Then from there, I think we were there for 5 days. And my mother went to see my oldest sister, who was in a Waimanu home. She had been in an accident when she was a baby and was terribly crippled, blind. She could hear. So that was the last time my mother ever saw her. And then we left Oahu on the Lurleen. And like Pat said, we were kind of on the bottom, we weren't first classers, in other words. And being rambunctious, I did get seasick. But after about 2 days, I was able to roam the hallways. My poor mother, who was seasick with a baby, with Sandra, my sister there, somebody had to take care of me. So this bachelor hooked up with me. He took me to eat, took me up on deck. And I remember when we reached San Francisco, we went under the Golden Gate Bridge, and I think it was either sunset or sunrise. I can't remember, but we did dock on one. I know it was across from San Francisco, no, from Oakland. And then later on, we were put into this ferry boat, and it was, I mean, we were crammed. Nobody could sit. Then they took us across to the other side, to Oakland, and we got on the train. And because my sister was a baby, we got a Pullman. We got to stay in the Pullman, so we were able to sleep at least on, beds. So it took us about 5 days to get to Jerome. And I remember going through some states where one side was a cliff and the other side, I mean, it was really scary. I thought the train would, kind of fall off and go down the cliff. When we got to Jerome, it was very late. We had to stay on board for a while. And I remember that beg your pardon, but the Kotongs had built this enormous bonfire for us, knowing that we were from Hawaii. So we debarked, and it was cold.
I do rely on my sister for what happened when we transitioned from Hawaii to Jerome, because I was only 2 years old at the time. And my memory is that when we were on the Lurleen, the only thing I can remember is running up and down some stairs with a lot of trepidation, because we weren't supposed to do that. And it was my sister, who was braver and more rascal, who encouraged me to do that. Once in Jerome, I remember missing my grandmothers very, very much. And I would ask in Japanese, because that was the first language I had spoken. Today I'm terrible, but I remember asking my parents, "Babang wa, where is grandma?" And my parents would answer it by saying that I would see her in 10 days. And at that young age, I couldn't count very well, and so I would start counting and lose track. And my parents would say, "No, you have maybe 5 more days to go, and then you'll see grandma." But that was, my most emotional reaction to internment at that time, possibly because I was so young, and my mother made sure that I felt safe, secure, and that my needs were met. So those are my faint memories. Just about that's it of Jerome. With a little background, I'm retired. I should give my name. Yeah, I'm Sandra Hoshida, and I'm a retired attorney. Live in Honolulu now.
Okay, we are back live now, and all our panelists that you just heard from are with us. June Hoshida-Honma and Sandra Hoshida, the sisters, Jerry Takesono and Patricia Nomura. And so if you have questions or comments, go ahead. Maybe one thing I could start with is that I'm curious about is, do any of you recall, was there any doubt that your families would return to Hawaii after being interned at Jerome and on the mainland, or was that pretty much a given?
Yeah, that's a big part of our family history. My mother was a Nisei. My father was Issei. And originally, they had determined that they were going back to Japan. My mother had been partially educated in Japan too, so she was fluent. But after they separated my parents again, and a month after I was born, my mother decided that she didn't want to go back to Japan, because I guess they were talking, and it must have been a terrible place to be. She must have thought it was a terrible place to be raising 2 children. I mean, it's a war-torn country. And so she told my father through telegrams that she was not going back to Japan. If he wanted to, he could himself, which is, a strong statement for a Japanese woman. Luckily, my father responded saying that we will repatriate to Hawaii. So that's why early when I spoke, that my name is Satoru, because we were going back to Japan. So when I was born, I was only given a Japanese name, whereas my older sister and my 2 younger brothers born post-war, they have English and Japanese names. I took on Gerald or Jerry afterwards, but I was going to make it legal, and I never did because it's part of our history.
Anyone else on that? Or we do have a question from the audience, from Andrew Wertheimer. Hi, Andrew. Were your parents Nisei? And were the Nisei Kibe? And I think it's a mixture. But
well, our parents were, my father was Issei and my mother was Nisei. However, my mother spoke more Japanese than she did, English. And my father valued education, so he was mainly self-taught. He went to school until he was in the 8th grade and then had to work in the cane fields after that. But he was highly educated because he educated himself. Am I right, Sam?
Right. Read all his life, had books all over the house, which is why I think all 3 of us daughters today are avid readers.
Mm-hmm.
what about Patricia's family?
Is she here? She didn't answer. I don't know.
We're having some audio issues. Well, we'll come back to her in a moment. Another question, also from Andrew, was have any of the panelists secured Freedom of Information Act records to see why your fathers were initially interned or detained?
Oh, I did. In my 3rd year in law school, I wrote a paper on whether the Korematsu situation could happen again today under our current legal system. And short answer is yes. But I was interested in what had happened to my father. So under the FOIA, I requested his records. And it turned out in a transcript, there was a transcript of his hearing in Hilo before he was sent away. And it seemed that it wasn't clear in the record whether there was one specific reason for his incarceration or internment. But my father recalls, and the transcript bears this out, that he got into an argument or a debate about the concept of Bushido because he was a black belt judo instructor. And in that discourse, he thought he had angered one of the panel members. And as a result, he found himself on the ship to an internment camp.
One of the things I heard from my father or someone was that he was training all those boys that he was teaching judo for the Japanese army. Now, I'm not really certain if that was true or not, but I was told this.
I had a similar experience when I got when we went to Jerome. We went to Tulu Lake at a reunion, and they told us to get this information because it's open. And so I got my father's records, and there was in the records, it was boring actually. It was just this and that. He did this, he did that. But there was one page in there that accused him of being a spy, that he was listening on a shortwave radio for troop movements and things like that. And I really questioned that because this is probably in 44, I think it was. And what does a guy who's been in prison for 2 years know about what's going on in the rest of the world? And my father always had an interest in history and current events. And he would listen when we were young on Kauai. He would listen to the shortwave radio every night because he wanted the news from Japan. He didn't want to hear it from other people. So he would listen intently to shortwave radio. So I can see him doing it in a camp if he had an access to shortwave radio, which is questionable, but he wanted, hard, solid information, not rumors, because rumors, from what I understand in the camps, were just rampant. Everybody had an idea of who's winning and who's losing, and on and on and on. But I thought that was interesting that my father was considered a spy.
Yeah, and a lot of the material in the files come from pretty suspect sources because there are a lot of rumors being reported and accusations made somewhat anonymously, and that was kind of the issue with the hearings, is that the internees were not allowed to actually contest any of these claims that were being made against them. That kind of led to kind of the kangaroo court kind of quality of these hearings. But anyway, we have a question from Hanako Wakatsuki. Hanako, as you may know, was just named the new director of the Honolulu NPS site. So she's just moved to Honolulu. She asks if you recall how your parents reflected on being incarcerated and whether that they talked about it at all after the war.
Yeah. I remember after returning to here, my father was still active in the Buddhist church, and we were told that we had to go to church. So one Sunday when we went, he decided to tell the story about how he was protected from enemies by going into the camps that he was, the POW camp he was sent to. He said, oh, they had guards and they were protecting us. So he reversed it so that I don't think my sisters and I were bitter about being in camp. Now, I'm not sure because I'm talking for Sandra. She might have another idea. But I remember her telling him, saying that in Sunday school. And so I wasn't afraid or, bitter about talking about it. But when I moved up here and mingled among the Kotongs, all of them were so bitter about it. And I couldn't understand because I was a kid. And because of what my father had done for me, I did not have the pictures that these mainland Japanese Americans had. So I remember those 3 years that I was in camp vividly.
My father had a scrapbook of pictures and he kept everything. You saw some of the pictures earlier when I was introducing myself. He had his passport, not a passport, it's identification papers. He had a Hitler mustache, of all things. He had pictures of the telegram he sent to my mother about repatriating to Hawaii, not to Japan. He kept many, many things. But they rarely talked about the internment camps. I mean, it was in such nice terms that I used to think of the internment camp like it was the other kind of, camps that kids go to on the mainland, especially. They go to like during summer. That's what I thought it was, because they always talked about it in nice terms and the friends they had, and how Mr. and Mrs. So and so were with us in Jerome and this and that. And so it was almost like, for us young people, a pleasant experience.
Well, I remember when we returned from internment camp, I think I was maybe preschool or just before going to school. And oftentimes I would be sitting with my mother, with her friends, and she would recall one particular event in the internment experience that I heard her repeat time and again. And that was the loss of our older sister, June,
Mhm.
Taiko, who had been placed in Waimano home because of her disabilities, and she was not with us at camp. And what happened was she died while we were still in camp. And now that, I think now June and I, now that we're mothers, I think we can appreciate how difficult that must have been. When I was younger, I thought, here she is telling the same story again and again, But once I became a mother, I realized what the impact of that event was to her. And that was to lose a child and not be able to protect that child. And feeling that your child was all alone and lonely and wanting mother, and I still get very emotional talking about that event. My father did do a TV interview with Ray Lovell many years ago, and this was on one of the Pearl Harbor bombing anniversaries, and Ray Lovell asked him what was his reaction to the internment experience. Was he bitter? And my father was very thoughtful, and his response was that he was grateful to the United States of America, that when he came back from internment camps, he was able to provide for his family, earn a living, and provide for his family. But I think that was a very Buddhist reaction of appreciation and gratitude on his part. I think for us, June, I returned with being extremely shy when I started school. And a lot of it was because I couldn't understand Pidgin. And I couldn't get into the conversations with my classmates, and it took me a number of years before I felt comfortable. But I don't recall talking about the internment camp ever to my classmates, and I sort of carried a feeling that it was something that our family had done wrong, and which is why we were sent away. And it wasn't until I was in law school and encountered the constitutional wrong that was done to Japanese Americans and Japanese Issei, that I realized how bad that experience was, and how it impacted many lives. And I'm glad we're doing this panel today, because I think we ought to give a face to that experience, and that we don't just end up talking about numbers. And it's meaningful, I think, this way.
Can you hear us now, Patricia?
Okay, listen. They're talking to you.
Can you hear us?
They're asking if you can hear.
Oh, a little.
Okay. Well, first of all, we had a comment from the audience, from Alden Hayashi. He writes, a huge mahalo to Patricia Kirita-Nomura for being editor of the Jerome Relocation Center memory book that was published in the mid-1980s, which is a wonderful artifact, which I think is now available. You can download it. Maybe we can add the link to that. But Alden also has a question. He asked that the Hawaii Jerome internees used to have reunions on Oahu at Natsunoya Tea House and Rainbow Garden. Do you still have reunions?
They're asking about Natsunoya.
What about?
Okay, we can't see the question. What is the question again? We can't. Oh, okay.
Yeah, whether you still have reunions.
Yeah, we went to, remember?
But I think you still have reunions.
Have a what?
If still have reunions there.
Oh, no, no,
Answer.
no, she didn't answer.
No, you can answer for that.
No, I think we only had one at the tea house, right, Sam?
Mhm. Right. I think that was it. Yeah.
Okay.
On a wall, yeah. The
Yeah, on
rest
a
were
wall.
here, and we had one in Torrance where Jim Ellington came, the owner of Jerome site, and spoke to us. And then thereafter, either it was in Little Rock or good old Vegas, where we used to have the reunions.
Yeah, and then there have been a couple of pilgrimages, of course, now back at in Arkansas.
Yeah, I went on a tour of the lower camps, WRA camps, and that's when I re-met Jim Ellington at his farm, where it's a site of the Jerome camp. And he was such a joker because I asked him, wasn't there a forest nearby and those 4 barns? And he says, oh, I got rid of them. And but that smokestack was still there. He said that the engineers were so good, he could not destroy the smokestack, and he could not destroy this huge catch basin that they had also built. Yeah.
And just to let people know in the audience, can you just tell us a little bit about who Jim Ellington is?
Well, Jim Ellington was a year younger than me, and he was the owner of the site of the Jerome camp. I think his son now runs it. I'm not sure. I really liked him. He was a very, very nice, very tall man. And he would come to our reunions. Like the first one he came was, as I said, in Torrance, California. And then thereafter he would come to the Little Rock. He went to the Little Rock reunion. He also went to the Vegas reunion. My husband and I had gone, and we didn't know whether Jim would be there. So as we're coming down the elevator opens up. We're in the elevator, and this tall man is there, and I'm looking up, and I was like, oh, Big John. And he came into the elevator with us throughout the reunion. Such a nice man, but he unfortunately died. So I think his son still runs the farm. They grow soybeans.
And I believe they also donated a little corner of land where there's the
Right.
Jerome little memorial that's at the site today, which is, I think, aside from the smokestack, it's the only kind of marker of the camp today. So go to another question. This from Ken Mochizuki, who asks, how did or would you react if your parents had decided to go to Japan and you had to go with them?
No, thank you.
Well, you know,
My father wanted to go back. My mother said no. She was Nisei.
Yeah, my mother is
So,
Nisei.
knew that.
If my mother hadn't refused to go back to Japan, we wouldn't have been able to help support our family. We would have been dependent on them to provide, a place to live. What little food would have to be shared even more. But because we went back to Hawaii, my father was able to send money and goods to, both his family and my mother's side of the family. So it was a good thing we didn't go back to Japan for more than the obvious reasons. I would have been a tourist coming to visit Hawaii with my cameras and coming off of a tour bus, So I'm glad we did not go to Japan.
And one question I had is, I come from an internee family also. My mom was interned. But one thing I always felt was like on the mainland, because everyone on the West Coast went to camp, there was no stigma because everybody went.
Mm.
But I feel like in Hawaii, there was a little bit of that, right? Where it was only a handful of people who were interned or a handful of families. Did you feel that growing up, that you were that family that had been interned?
Mhm.
Did you feel like your family was sent?
A
I know
definite yes.
he
Right.
went back to Helco to get a job because he worked at Hilo Electric Light Company. And the boss told his old boss said, I ain't hiring no Jap spy. And so he proceeded to repair appliances by using my mother's sister's garage. They were pretty well to do. So he was fixing appliances. Then he was going to open his own appliance repair shop on April 1st, 1946, was it, Sen? But anyway, that was the day that the tsunami came. And it
Oh my.
everything away, my father's tools, everything. And there was this very nice white man, Haole, Mr. Moses, who then asked him to uh, head his appliance department. So he got a job, supporting us. And my mother worked as a seamstress at, I think, Hata, wasn't it, San?
Mhm. Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And another fact, my sister Carol was the youngest internee ever to go into Jerome at age 2 months. It came out in the paper there. The
Yeah,
Jan M gave the
it's a
paper.
definite yes, because I think so few were interned that my mother was always concerned about what do the other people think. They
Uh,
must think we did something wrong, that they
uh,
arrested us. And I think that bothered her more than anything else, more than loyalty questions and that kind of stuff. It was what did the other people think, that we must have done something wrong, help the enemy or whatever she might have thought of. So I think a very definite yes.
Yeah, and then I wanted to see if we could get Patricia also.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
What was the
But
question?
when we went home to, well, my father decided that better to go to Hawaii where there are more opportunities. If we went to Japan, we would all be farmers, farmers' wives, and he started, a store in Kohala, and it was doing very well. So he felt the children had more opportunities in uh, Oahu. So the two older ones went, but we lived in a very, very poor situation, a house full of termites.
Keep talking.
And we lived right across a prostitute building, and we used to see all these sailors going out. But my sisters, one became a cosmetologist, and the other one went into nursing, and we lived. I had to have my boyfriends that was in high school, junior high or high school. They had to meet me on the street because the place was so dark, and besides the pool hall and the whorehouse, we weren't living in a good area. And I remember when in high school when I worked at the cannery, I would come home about 11:30 or so, and I would have to transfer on to right by the bar, and then when I get home, I had to walk through billiard where there are a lot of Filipinos and just uh, saying psst, psst, to get my attention. And it was really embarrassing to live there. On one side of this, we're above the club garage, and on one side there were no walls. So a dining room was there, and we had to, when the rain came into our kitchen, and uh, and my mom had to, uh, uh, and to hang our clothes. She would have to go on the futon roof that's slanted, and so we're always very careful when we went there. But then my sisters really helped, and I was able to. They were in going to Bible school, and the lady, the head of the school, she wasn't getting paid very much. So my sister, who was a cosmetologist, gave her permanents and sang. And so in place of that and setting her hair every week, uh, she asked my sister, what, I can't pay you, but would you like to take singing and voice lessons? And she replied, no, my younger sister would enjoy taking voice lessons. So that's how I got into music. And she also gave me and my younger sister scholarships to go to a Baptist college. And now I am a retired teacher and not doing too much because of all the ailments that come with old age uh, and being the COVID, uh, situation. It's very boring. I thought I might write about my whole life, but I don't seem to have the energy.
Well, I think we all hope you do. We're about the end of our session, so I want to wrap it up. But before we do, I just wanted to end by asking each of you why you think it is important to remember this story, which, being that you're on this panel, I assume that you all do. So
Why is it important?
yeah, maybe start with Jerry.
Oh, okay.
Jerry.
I think the biggest thing about Jerome and let's give Roar some credit too was I think they really helped the 442nd because those boys were nearby, relatively nearby, and we were the most eastern camp, so they could come to us. But the Buddha heads, the Hawaii soldiers, didn't know what the Kotonks were going through. They were dissensions with the two groups. And Dan Inouye says about how he made the trip up to one of the camps. He didn't specify which. And they saw, I get a little emotional when I say this, but he saw that the people were in prison and the Kotonks had volunteered to leave the prison to fight for this country that put them in prison. And so, they went to Jerome and the people welcomed them. They had parties and they brought all their food, whatever they could, together, and they entertained the boys. And from what you folks said, the young ladies went to visit them in Camp Shelby too. But when they went back, Dan always said, they were all very quiet. when they had gone to Jerome, they were singing, playing ukulele, and having a great time. When they went home, they were solemn. And this really, really gelled the Kotonks and the Buddha heads into a fighting team, because now they knew what they were fighting for. They were fighting for their people. And so, as I said, I get emotional because those guys, many of them didn't come back. And this is probably their last experience with other Japanese. And, I'm glad we were in Jerome. We were able to help them, bring their spirits up and bring them to be a good fighting team so that we can be proud of them, because they went on and, man, they made us lift our heads up. That's what the Nisei soldiers did.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, that was a unique element of the Arkansas camps, the connection to Camp Shelby. So maybe next to June.
What was the question again?
On the importance, why it's important to remember this story.
Well,
I heard that.
when I returned, I never spoke about the internment. I was just trying to fit in. I didn't fit in because I was speaking like a Kotonk. I had to learn Pidgin really fast. They didn't know which room to put me in grammar school when I returned to Hilo. We had what we call ABC classes, A being those who were the smartest, B being average, and C being those who were slow learners. Well, they put me in the B class, and I had very good friends there. Everybody made me welcome. I didn't feel like an outsider. Then one day, my principal decided that I had to go to the A class. Now, it was overwhelming for me, and I think that's when my self-esteem really got low, because I wasn't a foreigner as far as they were concerned. I didn't speak like them. I had to learn Pidgin real fast, really, really fast. But I think that made my self-esteem remain very, very low for a long time. She took me to that class 3 times. First, she left me outside and said, go in. So I waited for her to return to her office, and I went back to my old class. Second day, she pulled me out again, and then did the same thing, and I walked back to my old class. And then the third time, there was no running away. She put me in class, the reception I got in there wasn't very good, because my teacher, Mrs. Kealoha, was a very good friend of my parents. And she says, oh, I remember June. She was so cute. She had this nice pug nose, and that's what she did. Yeah, that was it. After that, everything went downhill. So I had a difficult time readjusting, into Hilo, even though they were my kind of people. I mean, they were Japanese Americans. But so that's the way I remained until I graduated from high school, because I just felt that I was not a part of that group. I had to work hard in order to make friends. I had to learn Pidgin real fast. I had to do it was, I want to go back to camp. That's all I can tell you.
And then Patricia, on why you believe this is important, the story that we're telling today is important for people to know about.
When I went back to Kohala, I was in a top class, and I don't know why, except maybe I spoke better English than the local, Pidgin English. So, but I had a difficult time because I was in that class. I was in a class that had higher math, and it was very difficult. To this day, I'm not very good at math, but people, I guess, when they accepted us, but many of them, especially my friends, they said they saw our store all locked up, and they wondered what happened to me because I never got a chance to even say goodbye to them. And but it was difficult living in Oahu too, because we lived in, very poor conditions. But I'm glad that I was able to go to college, and you know, I'm now a retired teacher, and I think in America, if you really work hard, you'll get there. Maybe not to the top for some of us average people, but I know that regardless of where we came from or whatever, it I'm glad I came to Hawaii, and I'm glad that I was able to accomplish what I set out to do. And it's because we live in America that we could do this.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. And then Sandra, we'll end with you.
We're talking about the importance of
Yeah, of why we should remember this story.
Oh, certainly. I think that prejudice is something that all of us have to work at overcoming. And holding a panel like this, remembering the internment experience, is a way for us to look at our past as a nation. I hope I'm not sounding too preachy, but to not forget how bad things can be when we forget to care for one another. And yes, there were constitutional infractions during World War II that led to the incarceration of Japanese Americans and Issei. But when it comes down to an individual, it's for all of us. Each of us has a responsibility, I think, to fight prejudice, and we see it today. There's been by the tone of our former leader, there has been cast a blanket blame on Asians for our current pandemic situation. And we have to be careful. We have to watch our words. We have to watch our actions, of course. And I think it behooves us to remind ourselves what the consequences can be when we forget. And I think this effort on the part of you, Brian, and Kimiko and others to keep the internment experience alive and meaningful is so important. And I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you all panelists for taking part, and thanks to our audience. I just want to close with a brief plug for another program that Densho will be doing in a week or so called Unexpected Sites of World War II Incarceration on April 21 at noon Pacific time. One of the panelists will actually be doing something quite relevant to this panel. It'll be Heidi Kim, who edited the book on the Hoshida family,
Right.
We'll be
Mhm.
talking about the research she's done on the 2 hotels in North Carolina, the Assembly Inn and the Grove Park Inn, that housed Japanese American families from Hawaii going to reunite with their husbands or fathers, including my mom's family. They were there on their way to Crystal City. There'll be 2 other really interesting, unusual stories too. So it'll be on April 21 at noon, and you can register for that on Densho's website. So anyway, with that, thanks everyone for taking a part of this, and have a great rest of the day.